Just, and then when you're done, you just unclip it, hand it over.
Okay. Before we get started, I just wanted to familiarize students in case you didn't know where they were. The bathrooms are located to the left, right down the hallway, and feel free to use whatever bathroom best fits your gender identity. Good. Just going to wait another minute or two and we'll start, and then whoever joins us. Everybody hear my voice? Yes, okay, very good, very good. Should we start and then we'll...
Yeah, I think we're good to start.
That's good, okay.
Very least, I think everyone who is.
Remind me to pass this to you when
Yeah.
we're done, okay.
All right.
Okay, welcome everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to our first workshop series on the topic of neurodiversity and neuroinclusion. And this workshop series is being sponsored by Equality Mental Health, which is a dedicated practice for the LGBTQ+ community, providing outpatient mental health services, including individual psychotherapy, couples therapy, family and child and adolescent psychotherapy, and we also have a variety of different groups for the community. We have a wonderful website, so please check us out. Okay, well, we are delighted to have you here in attendance to discuss and learn more about the experience of being neurodivergent. And before we begin, I'd like to thank the River Edge Public Library for hosting us, and also for all the wonderful help that we've received from the interns of Equality Mental Health. So thank you so much, everyone, for helping out. Today we are going to dispel some of the mysteries surrounding the concept of neurodiversity. This is a term that many of us have heard, but may not be familiar or very knowledgeable about it. And today we are fortunate to have an excellent instructor on the topic. Kay Peterman is a graduate student of public health and social work at New York University. They have an excellent working knowledge of the subject and also self-identify as being. Kay has extensive experience working with neurodivergent youth and also serves as an advocate for the neurodivergent community. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the table to Kay, and I'm going to have Kay begin our program for today. Thank you so much for being.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, awesome. And then before we start, if anyone, it's easier for accessibility reasons for anyone to access the slides on your phone to read along. You can use the QR code to access them. So I'll just give you a minute. But yeah, so today we're going to be talking about the concept of neurodiversity and how to do neuroinclusion. Also go over the differences in neurodivergent processing and experiences, and give a broad overview of actionable steps to be neuroinclusive. As we go along, feel free to ask questions, as happy to make this a conversation more than me talking at you the whole time. If you need to move around at any point or stand up rather than sitting down, feel free to do so. Just if you're going to do a lot of it, maybe go towards the back so you're not distracting people. We also have STEM toys over there. If those would be helpful for focus at any point, I can get up and get one. Like I said, if it's helpful, you can look at a copy of the presentation. In terms of the agenda, we're going to go through like 6 sections today. They're not all going to be equally spaced, but there is going to be a brief break after each one. We're going to have 4 1-minute breaks and 1 5-minute break, 5-minute break, just if people have trouble focusing for 2 hours, because that's a long time. In the first section, we're just going to go over language and defining terms. In the second one, we'll go over the history of the neurodiversity movement, where we are now, and also some movements that overlap with it. Then we're going to have 2 sections on differences in neurodiversity and neuroprocessing, and on the diversity of neurodivergent experiences, and then a brief section on different ways to make things accessible, and a Q&A. So just first a note on language. Throughout the presentation, we're going to be using identity-first language, which rather than person-first language. So that would be autistic person versus person with autism. This is the broad preference of the autistic community, and also other neurodivergent communities as well. There are some where it's a bit harder, like for people with ADHD, there's a tendency to prefer AD. And this is to put the emphasis on that as an inherent part of the person's experience, because it's how their brain works, rather than as something that needs to be cured. We'll also be avoiding high functioning and low functioning labels, just because those are, and instead do less visible support needs and high support needs. Sorry, 1 minute. My voice is undergoing a renovation, so it gets a bit tight sometimes. Okay. And this just puts high functioning and low functioning kind of are value judgments on the person, whereas putting the emphasis on the support needs talks about the practical things rather than putting an emphasis on anyone's deficiencies or perceived deficiencies. And then the one other thing is instead of nonverbal, the term non-speaking, this is the preference of the non-speaking community, because many of them do have access to words, just they don't speak them. Especially like once you type or use augmentative or alternative communication, they have access. They use the words, just not verbally. None of these will be universal. There will be people in the population who prefer the alternative ones. This is just broad preferences. Okay, so defining terms. So neurodiversity. In general, neurodiversity is just the fact of human existence. We all have different brains in a lot of different ways. Nick Walker put it really well. It's just the diversity of human minds and the infinite variation in neurocognitive functioning within our species. It's just a fact. So an individual can't be neurodiverse because it's describing the whole population, which is where you see a lot of people misusing. And also a group of just neurodivergent people isn't necessarily neurodiverse. It would be a mix of all different neurotypes. Okay, so then to differentiate it, the neurodiversity paradigm is a perspective of neurodiversity. And it's different from the pathology paradigm. So the pathology paradigm is kind of what the medical system has been doing for several decades, where it's like there are all these different brains, and some of those brains work correctly, and others of them need to be fixed and treated because they're performing wrong, or they're doing things wrong. The neuroparadigm views neurodiversity as natural and doesn't see any particular brain as normal or healthy or something that needs to be fixed. And the result, and also sees the result of this are social dynamics that are very similar to the social dynamics for other forms of the majority often will exclude the minority or discriminate against them in one way or another. And that brings us to neurodivergence. So neurodivergence, or being neurodivergent, is a broad umbrella referring to anyone who differs from neurotypical majority. So it's or just the standard way of being normal. There are both innate forms of neurodivergence, like being autistic and ADHD, dyslexic, etc. And then there are also acquired versions. So if you get a traumatic brain injury, you struggle afterward, or you repeatedly use mind-altering chemicals, or you meditate for 40 years and that changes how your brain works. Your brain changes, you're no longer neurotypical, and that is an acquired form of it. Also PTSD. An individual could be neurodivergent in multiple ways. So for example, I am autistic and have ADHD. I also have migraines as the result of a traumatic brain injury. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with that. And so I have both innate and acquired forms of neurodivergence. So just as a visual, the whole population in the circle is neurodiverse. The majority are neurotypical, the purple ones, and then within that you have neurodivergent people. And then where the conversation usually gets a lot of focus is that then within that neurodivergent group are people who are neurodivergent and disabled. And the way that the neurodiversity paradigm looks at those disabilities is with the social model. So broadly, disability is any condition that significantly affects one's ability to do tasks related to everyday functioning. Typically, we look at disability with the medical model. So the medical model considers disability as something to treat or fix. So for example, someone in a wheelchair is in that wheelchair and disabled because of their condition. The social model looks at disability as something caused by the environment and the social scene around them. And so the person in the wheelchair is disabled because the building doesn't have a ramp for them to get in, rather than because they're in a wheelchair. So the neurodiversity model looks at the disabilities caused by neurodivergence to be generally more on the social model. However, this will vary from different forms of neurodivergence. So typically, more physical stuff like people who are epileptic or have migraines generally would be more of the medical model because there's only so much socially you can do there. Whereas people who are sick or happy, generally more of the social model because there isn't a problem until you're interacting with people who tell you it's a problem. And then a lot of the time it can be a combination of the two. So like for ADHDers, a lot of ADHDers are on medication to help them deal with the world, which like the need to deal with the world is still a social problem, but they are approaching it with the medical model. And how different people view their different disabilities will vary from person to person. So like don't assume one way or another for an individual. So within this neurodiversity paradigm, view diagnoses considering it's a very non-pathologizing view. In general, they support self-identification for more social forms of neurodivergence. So like you can self-identify as autistic or as having ADHD. Don't self-identify as having epilepsy. Probably not a good idea. But at the same time, if you want to seek an evaluation for something after you self-identify as it, that's also okay. And for that reason, people should be able to access evaluations more easily in terms of cost and also accuracy, et cetera. Yes. That is the end of the first section. Just quick check-in. Any questions on that? No, that's a lot of terms. Okay. And then we have just a quick 1-minute break. If anyone wants to move or get some coffee. My voice gets so phlegmy now. Huh? My voice gets so phlegmy now, and then it does this. Whenever I try to project, I swear.
It sucks.
I hate testosterone in some ways. I hate this part of being on testosterone. Yeah.
You can stop letting go. I don't think you want to do that, though.
No, I hate this part of the process.
Yes.
There's so much phlegm. Okay, so Okay, so we're done with our 1 minute break, if everyone's good? Awesome. So now we go into section 2, which is just the history of the neurodiversity movement. So the origins of the neurodiversity movement started in the 1990s. During the 80s and 90s, like a lot of other marginalized groups, the internet enabled more autistic people specifically act with each other in chat rooms and share their experiences and perspectives. This resulted in the organizing of groups like Autistic Network International, which I don't think is still around, but like very much informed the work of people today, and also people like Jim Sinclair giving a very famous speech within the movement called "Do Not Mourn Us," which was just about the fact that like people were approaching autism like it was a deadly illness, when it's just like, no, we're people and we can have lives, and stop treating us this way. And this culminated in the first publishing of the term neurodiversity, references to it like neurological differences in 1997 and 1990, Bloom and Judy Singer. Moving into the 2000s and 2010s, this then gained momentum through and visibility through scholarship and activism. So there were a lot more scholars publishing on neurodiversity, like Nick Walker, who was in the first couple slides, who is a trans autistic scholar who has written a lot on this. And then also the founding of organizations like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. I will also say that like for as broad an umbrella as neurodiversity is, this is why like a lot of, as broad of an umbrella as neurodivergent is, this is why a lot of conversations around it will focus mainly on autism. Autistic people have its long jump on conceptualizing themselves under the neurodiversity umbrella. So then we get into the 2020s, and with social media and the pandemic, people just got to see it more, or got to see more of neurodivergent, and like just it kind of blew up. And this has been an overall positive effect, just because there's greater awareness of and more adoption of the neurodiversity framework and paradigm, with more people being aware that they are neurodivergent and adding their perspectives to the mix. At the same time, there is a bit of a downside because it blew up on social media. There's a lot of people who have adopted the language of neurodiversity without fully understanding this. So this is where you get people saying like, taking a non-pathologizing framework that prefers identity first language and going person with neurodiversity, a person with neurodivergent, then neuro. So yeah, so the original meanings have gotten a bit muddled. But still, it is an overall good thing. But the overall goal is still to, beyond visibility, it is to get to a point where neurodivergent people are fully accepted and included and can thrive. So future goals for the movement and focus of funding, because right now a lot of research for neurodivergent conditions focuses on things like early interventions and treatment rather than social services and ways to be inclusive. A lot of that research is done by neurotypical people into neurodivergent people and doesn't include them, which is inherently lopsided and destined to provide fully accurate results. Also working to better include neurodivergent people with other marginalized identities. A lot of research has focused on white men, which excludes a lot of people, but there has been more of a shift in the last decade, and the hope is to shift it more. We'll see how this administration goes. And then addressing the needs of overlooked neurodivergent groups, which includes adults, those who are non-speaking, those that can have more extreme presentations, because they often get left out of the conversation, and just those with less visible support needs. And then at the same time, overlapping movements that haven't gotten the boost in visibility that the neurodiversity movement has. The disability justice movement, which is an evolution of the disability rights movement developed by queer, trans, and BIPOC people to have a more intersectional approach to disability. And they do specific neurodivergence in their principles. It was developed by Sins Invalid, and they have 10 principles of disability justice that are really cool to look at and very much aligned with the neurodiversity paradigm. And then there's also the Mad Pride movement, which also started in the 90s, and it was mainly started by people who were institutionalized for psychiatric reasons, and on the basis of reclaiming words like psycho or mad or words like that, and to turn them into positive words that they wear with pride. And so they have the neurodivergent view as well, just a different approach to it. How are we doing with that? This is the short section. Okay, any questions on this? Okay, awesome. I do have another 1-minute break here. How are people feeling on that front? Okay, great. Do you need a tissue? We have one here. And we also have coffee since you just got in, if that would be helpful. Okay. Awesome. I'm doing good. Talking through the phlegm of my voice transitioning. Yeah. Okay, awesome. So if everyone's feeling good, do people want to take a break or go on to the next section? Okay, we'll go to the next section. Then, okay, so there is differences in cognition for neurodivergent people. It's the first part. So just overview of the differences that neurodivergent people can experience. This is specifically going over processing. They generally fall into the categories of cognitive processing differences, sensory processing differences, executive functioning differences, and cognition differences. Note, like, these are not going to be all encompassing, just again, because the breadth of the term neurodivergent. And again, like, there is a very autistic focus on these because autistic people have a 20-year jump on everyone else. And also, like, these are not, individuals are going to experience differently. If you meet one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. If you meet one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person. These are just broad umbrellas that seem to affect the most people as of now. And also, there are a lot more theories than I can cover in the amount of time we have. So, like, this is just like a selection that is very biased towards what it helps, and that might be different with another presenter. Okay, so first, like, we've all heard of, like, autism being a spectrum, and typically when we think of a spectrum, it's a line. What it really is generally more like this chart where it's like you have the differences, and where they're really good, like this person's really good at executive functioning, or this person is really good at executive functioning but less good at the social stuff. So, like, it'll be less of a line and more of a chart where people have different challenges and different strengths, and that is a lot more mixed amongst neurodivergent, neurotypical people will generally have a more even skill set, whereas neurodivergent people, there will be a lot more differences, and they'll be really strong in one area and really weak in another. And which ones those are will vary from person to person. And one thing that could lead to that, top-down versus bottom-up processing. So top-down processing is when you have, like, a big concept of something. So, like, you have a big concept of, like, what a car is. And so when you see a car, you just go, ah, yes, car, and it's done. So you take big concept and apply them to the situation. Bottom-up process, instead, you take in all of the details, so like wheels, windows, bumpers, the fact that there are exhaust fumes, and you build that into the image in your head and go, ah, yes, that's a car. Usually, everyone does both of these, and usually it's happening too fast for you to notice. But it's been found that a lot of neurotypical people tend to use top-down processing more, which, like, is good. In some ways, it has its strengths. It's very fast and efficient. You can understand more things quickly and make decisions more quickly. But it can also lead to generalizations and missing details or nuances because you already have the big concept. Why do you need to understand everything else? A lot of neurodivergent people can tend more towards bottom-up processing. So that's just processing things in a way that can be more in-depth as a strength. It can also creative thinking, because if you're taking all the details in, you could build them up in different ways or connect them to different things. And also, it just is very unique. And that's where, like, a lot of the variation could come in, because, like, if you're building things, details up into a picture, there's a lot more freedom for what that picture turns out to be. However, at the same time, that can also lead to overwhelm if there's a whole lot of details to do, to process. That can just get to be a lot. You also can find people who need more information and time to fully understand things. So like the idea of like the autistic kid who understands something, but when they do, they have it down fully and immediately. And then also it can lead to increased anxiety. So a lot of that is, one, the overwhelm, and two, if you're taking in all the details all the time, you're more likely to notice when things are different, and to less certainty of how the world works or what is going on, just because you're noticing when things are different more. And that makes the world inherently less certain and more anxiety-provoking. Next theory is monotropism. This was actually a theory developed by autistic people, though I don't know if they knew they were autistic when they came up with it. They found out later. So according to this theory, we all have a limited attention budget. And the majority of people tend to have an easier time allocating their attention to multiple things at once. So like maybe we're not all good at multitasking, but you can better keep track of, my phone is pinging, I have, if someone's talking, and I have things to do. But some people, mainly autistic people, can have struggle with that and have an easier time focusing on a few things at once or one thing at once, which is where autistic people get a lot in their well-being by hyper-focusing on like areas of interest, or just being able to focus on things in depth at the same time. So one is allotropic attention, when you're having focusing on more things at once, and another is monotropic attention. And like, again, everyone does both of these. It's more what is easier for your brain to do. And like the world asks us, because it's easier for most people, to use allotropic attention. Sorry, I'm gonna get a drink real quick. Okay, there we go. It's easier for more people to use allotropic attention. So the world is built for that more. And if you're doing the one that is harder for you all the time, it's easier to get more exhausted and overwhelmed, etc. And so a lot of neurodivergent people need allotropic attention as a way to relax and like find fulfillment in life. And then one other theory for cognitive processing I'm going over today, this is kind of borderline cognitive because it's the nervous system, but the nervous system is connected to your brain. But interspace nervous systems versus nervous system. And this is actually a theory for ADHD. So it's the idea that people with ADHD, their nervous systems are more activated and interested in doing tasks based on areas they're interested or value. And whereas non-ADHD nervous systems are more importance-based. So they tend to be activated by what is most urgent or what gets them more status. And so that can lead to a lot of executive functioning issues. It could also be more, you can also see where it could apply to different kinds of neurodivergence. I'm sorry for my voice is transitioning and it's being very weird right now. Thank you. So for one group, it is, it can be easier to, for the people with importance-based nervous systems, it can be easier to do basic day-to-day tasks, to take care of themselves, and to prioritize long-term. Whereas for people with interest-based nervous systems, it can be easier to focus on something when there's a reward they're interested in, it aligns with something they value, or it's related to an area of interest, which can apply to a lot of different forms of neurodivergence outside of ADHD. We can see that. That's why I bring it up, I should say. So takeaways for this section are just neurodivergent experiences exist on a spectrum, and then there are different ways that people's brains can cognitively process information and motivate themselves, and these include versus bottom-up processing, attention allocation differences, and interest-based nervous systems versus importance-based nervous systems. Do we have any questions on that? Yes?
I have two questions. One,
Yep.
You could talk a little bit about the concept of stimming.
Okay, yep, that is in the next section, the next section.
Perfect, okay. And it's, a number of clients who I work with struggle with issues related to procrastination.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about some ways that interest versus importance.
Yes, that can be a big one there. So, and that's kind of where there's a bit of an overlap versus importance. Also line up with executive functioning, but that can be a big one with procrastination. So like if it's a task that they aren't interested in, it can be a lot harder for them to motivate themselves with the nervous system. So what can help with that would be pairing it with a task that they are interested in. So like listening to a doing chores while listening to a podcast with something they're interested in, or body doubling so that there's a person there, which it is helpful with motivating that because they are interested in one person. Or like doing task stacking, so doing something you enjoy and then doing using momentum to do the thing that is harder to motivate themselves to do. Yep. Any other questions? Yep.
Are you going to talk about when it comes to monotropism, how it's easy to so intensely focus on something for such a long period of time that you lose track of everything else? Like if there's terms in there, hearing you say about that.
Like hyper-focus is what you're asking? I wasn't going to cover that in depth today just because like we have a relatively short period of time, but did you have something specific you wanted to ask about that? Okay, yeah. So I guess just for those who aren't familiar, so with monotropism, like the whole idea of like it's easier to focus on a few things that it can sometimes to for people to hyper-focus or like get into flow state is like the other word that's used for it, where you're just focused on something for several hours at a time and you completely lose track of time and everything else going on, which neurodivergent people tend to do a lot more and find a lot of joy in. Did anyone else have any questions? Okay, awesome. So we're gonna have another. This is a longer break. We can also keep going if people want to keep going. How are you feeling? Okay, awesome. Okay, so this is part 2. So this one is where we cover stimming. So this is sensory processing differences. I like using the model of sensory integration, which is from occupational therapy. It's about and process sensory information. So based off of this, we have 8 senses that we use. So there's the 5 we all know about: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. But then there's also proprioception, which is your sense of your body in space or your body in motion. There's vestibular, which is like your sense of about, and interoception, which is your sense of your feelings inside. So based off of this theory, people with sensory processing differences have 3 main ways where they could be different. They could be more sensory sensitive or sensory avoidant, depending on how you want to classify it. So that means they're more sensitive to certain input and they might avoid it, so too much of it. There's also sensory insensitive or sensory seeking, which is where you're less sensitive to that to certain sensory input and you might seek it out more. So like for an example of sensory seeking is someone who finds noise is really loud, so they might wear headphones all the time. Or an example of sensory seeking is would be a very common one is being proprioceptively seeking. So that would be people who are like bumping into walls all the time, or like a little kid who likes to crash into the floor, because that helps give them a sense of space. Also, using weighted blankets actually came from occupational therapy because that gives you a sense of space because you have all of that pressure there. And then there's also mixed signals or mixed processing. So that can be someone who, the most common one you see this with is auditory. So someone who like will listen to loud metal music and be fine with it, but when they get into a crowd of people who are all talking at once, it's harder to keep track of it. And that's like a form of mixed processing, just because like it's harder for your brain to process different inputs coming in different ways. And for people with sensory processing differences, which of these they can experience can vary from sense to sense and also from environment to environment. So for some, generally fine with things like touch, but once they're in an environment where it's very noisy and they're very stressed and then it gets very crowded, they might no longer like touch in that environment and they might become more sensitive to it. And then many neurodivergent people engage in behaviors to help regulate their sensory system. Most common of these is stimming or doing a repetitive motion so that they have that consistent input to help with their processing. So like one example of this is I'm always playing with this ponytail. Another one would be if you know people who like to drum on their desks. You could also do like rocking back and forth like this against the wall. There are people with auditory stims, so that could be saying the same thing over and over again or like making a certain noise repeatedly. And that's just to provide themselves with consistent input that is predictable to them so that their brain has an easier time processing all of the other different sensory input that's going on. There's a lot of other things behaviors people do for sensory regulation, but generally with a neurodivergent person, taking a sensory lens first is always a good start. One area in particular that I like to emphasize for sensory processing with this, interoception differences. So that's your sense of what's going on inside your body. I'm gonna take a drink real quick. Okay. So interoception is your sense of like how inside covers both physical cues, like I'm hungry or I need to go to the bathroom, and also emotions like I'm angry and I'm sad, because those are all based off of signals coming from the organs inside your body into your brain and your brain interpreting them a certain way. And for a lot of neurodivergent people, they can have they can either be more sensitive to these signals, have a harder time perceiving them at all, or a mix of the two. So like they get a lot of the signals, but they don't know how to interpret them. And what this can result in is like increased emotional intensity, or just sensitivity to their emotions, more aware of them, people are, and thus being more sensitive. There's also alexithymia, which is difficulty identifying emotions. So I know I'm feeling something, but I don't know what it is, which is super fun. And then also needing more time to process emotions. So feeling fine when you're there, and then realizing 3 days later you're angry. And it's just that your brain just caught up on processing that. So this can lead to a lot of problems just in terms of regulating, and also things like outbursts, and also just not knowing how to communicate your emotions, or going along with something without realizing how you feel about it. And there's also a big one where, like in situations where there's a lot of external input, so like a lot of people around you, or you're making eye contact, sometimes people can lose track, who are otherwise good at interoception, can lose track of what they're feeling inside. So they might need to go to a quiet place so they can get out. Any questions on this? Just because, like, I know it's a lot. Okay.
When you're talking about difficulty identifying emotions, is that strictly for internalized emotions, or is that also considered for external, like being able to read other people? Is that more specifically just for internal?
That's more specific. Internal, external would be empathy. Like there are some neurodivergent people who have more effective empathy, where like it can affect their internal emotions, and that can be a lot to sort out as well. But in terms of this, it's usually mainly the internal sensations, because usually like differentiate this from something like dissociation, or like being completely not present with your emotions. It's just like, okay, do you also have trouble telling when you are hungry and need to go to the bathroom, because it's like the physical sensations as well. Yep.
I can't quote the studies, but we've learned that repetitive motions like actually quiet brain waves.
Yeah.
So that's the reinforcer. So instead of saying stop doing that, we have to substitute something else that will calm.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Like I would say this is kind of my substitution for doing that too, because it does help calm the brainwaves, because it's giving that consistent sensory input, so there is something to hold on to rather than getting completely overwhelmed. Absolutely. Anyone else? Okay. Awesome. So now we're just going to go on to executive functioning issues, such as procrastination. So going back to like the bottom-up versus top-down processing, executive functioning is a lot of top-down skills, and so neurodivergent people can have trouble with them. So they include inhibiting or delaying the urge to act on different impulses, like so interrupting people, very impulsively without fully knowing why. It can affect working memory, which is your memory of what's going on immediately, so keeping track of things from minute to minute or second to second. Cognitive flexibility, so just being able to, if you had one idea of how a day was going to go and then something happens where you have to change it, being able to switch things up, or if you learn a new idea, being able to being able to incorporate that into your sense of what's going on. Planning out tasks and organizing things is a big one, and usually the one that is most visible to other people. Time management, self-awareness, perseverance, which, like, if you're bad at all of these other ones, yeah, it's pretty hard to persevere because, like, everything else is frustrating too. Yeah, does anyone have any examples of, like, where they've had executive functioning issues or questions about how these might show up? Yep.
Yeah, I'm a teacher, and I have a student that definitely has trouble with impulsivity. And the interesting, he's classified as ADHD, and the interesting thing about him is, because I've been teaching a long time, he's actually able to focus during a lesson. So, like, for instruction, and he's pretty bright, so he's very focused, and he listens, he's good read, but the minute there's unstructured time, which is like just a second, he goes right into complete impulsivity, and he becomes disruptive. He can't sit still. He's in people's faces, and I'm having a hard time with him, trying to work with him. Like, I have my problem is, like, he really can't control the impulsivity in the behavior plan. Like, he's getting used to stopping and looking at my reaction, but he really struggles with like just that gym time, whatever it is. He needs the time out. Like, I see that, but, like, it could just be a moment of transition. That's 2 seconds, and he's becoming. I mean, I have him in 4th grade. He's, people are labeling him as a behavior problem, and he's not really, because I work with him a lot, but he's perceived can't control.
Yeah, that's definitely a struggle. So it sounds like he's good at the focusing, and it's more when there's not focus and there's choices that he tends to go with whatever the first impulse is.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, no, so maybe that's something where it's like giving him choices of what to do, or like going before a break, going like, okay, we're going on a break. These are the things that might be good to do. There is something to decide to focus on. And without knowing the kid, but like that's something where we would do when I was working at another place. We had a lot of kids with that issue. So we'd like be like, okay, we're going on a break. These are the things you could do, and like, you can do other things, but like having a list and choices seem to help a lot. You had a question?
Yeah, or I was just going to piggyback on that comment. It made me think of, I work with a few students, and in the age of electronic learning, and having to go home and sign into your student accounts, and then it's often a problem because parents are struggling with their kids that I work with. There's a misfire that often goes on with just signing in and then looking at your academic progress and how it tracks down, sometimes even to the day of the assignment. And one of the reflective experiences I often have, especially in these home visits, with these children who have neurodivergence, is the parents are upset with them about whatever the current state is of how assessed online with all the classes in the homework. And I look at it, and then I see overall, I see a big picture like the car, right? I see a good student. I see if I just quickly scan the average of all the things there, the total body of work is good. But then I see how an older child, a teenager, who's struggling, they don't see that overall body of work that they're doing as a student. Instead, they don't even want to look at it because all they see is class by class, homework assignment in the drop-down menu for every single class. It's so overwhelming, you can't even be looked at, and all they see is all the fine details that are not being done. They don't see the car like we were saying before. They see all these different incompletions, all these different deadlines that are overdue, and it's very difficult for them to look at and to approach. So that made me think of what you're bringing up about executive functioning.
Yeah, no, like the incompletions are definitely like a big thing that can come up with executive functioning challenges, and also the kind of the shame spiral that could send you in if like you have a long list of incompletions. And you're absolutely right with like focusing on the details in the trees. Like I also with the crisis line, a lot of what I would be doing there is drawing out the forest from the trees, because people would be focusing on that and it would be trying to work it out. It sounds like a lot of this problem is just like the online presentation of it, or like or the portal.
I think that's it. It's in reality, you have a good student because of how the presentation of the information is being depicted to the student. It's extremely counterproductive. It produces a lot of unnecessary inner conflict, and when you don't. I'm just going to say, typical, right? When you only want to see the world the way you want to see things, and design things the way you want to see things, you're creating a lot of unnecessary
stress.
Consequences.
Yes, and that actually ties into a concept that we're going to get into next with how the world is built in general. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're good.
I'm trying to judge, just piggybacking as well, just that the transition from a space that is school environment to then being at home, and how to assess how neurodiversity affirming each environment is and the differences can also have a massive impact on how, an individual can access, what they're able to access in the school environment, I think that's an added kind of like variable, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then we have another comment in the back.
Yeah, this has been my experience as a student. I'm a veterinary nursing student right now, and because most of the content is now online, we don't have enough instructors. It's just the way it is. I'm looking through all of it, and it gets overwhelming. And then that leads to what I was talking about before. I will obsessively, intensely focus on getting it all done. I'll completely lose track of all of my survival needs.
Yep, that is a common problem. Out of curiosity, are you getting that mode like right before everything is due? Everything is due as well?
Yeah, I try to get it done way ahead of time.
Okay.
And then that becomes a
Yeah, that's a fun cycle a lot of neurodivergent people get into, where like it can be a struggle to start things, and then you hyper focus and you lose track of the survival needs, and then you get the shame spiral if something doesn't get done, you're struggling, and that just kind of enhances the stress and makes everything worse. With the online portals, it's definitely hard. Like generally, like being able to write it down and plan it out on your own can be helpful, or having an accountability buddy, or setting with the hyper focus, there can also be setting timers so that you're checking in with yourself about am I drinking water? Yeah, can be also really helpful. Do we have any more thoughts on this in general? I know like executive functioning is like a huge area. Yeah.
I guess my question is, when showing up for somebody who's experiencing this type functioning issue, is being able to sort of like kind of prompt them to get things done on the schedule that they need to without like kind of initiating that spiral. Any like tips for that?
A lot of that will vary from person to person. A big one will be breaking down steps. So there's a lot of ADHD parenting stuff where it's just like having all of the steps for chores written down and put by the thing for the chore, so there's a visual prompt. And honestly, like having visual prompts can be really good. There's I know there's apps like Finch and Habitica that it gamify doing regular tasks or doing things like school assignments, which like hits that interest-based nervous system thing, and also just dopamine. But yeah, it will vary a lot from person to person, because there are people that will prompt as long as like they're nice and they're not shaming you for not doing it yet. But there are also people where that will be more stressful as well. So it's very much based off of individual needs and experiences, because yay, the diversity of neurodiversity. These are all really great questions. Does anyone else have anything they want to share? Okay. So then now we get into just communication differences. So, and this kind of goes into like systems not being built for neurodivergent people as well. So the double empathy problem was developed by Damien Milton, autistic sociologist. But it can be broadly applicable not just to neurodivergent people, but a lot of marginalized experiences. It's based off of research that found like social deficits that autistic people have went away when they were interacting with autistic people. And that also, if you looked at the non-autistic people interacting with the autistic people, they had the same deficits in the interaction. So the theory goes that when a non-autistic person and an autistic person interact, the autistic person is labeled the problem because the non-autistic person is not used to having to empathize with a minority communication style. So like any two people trying to empathize and connect with each other. But in the case of someone with a more marginalized communication style or experience, the person from the majority group is just going to deem them a problem rather than, in a lot of cases, will deem them the problem rather than putting in the work to meet them in the middle. And so the margin ends up doing twice as much empathizing or twice as much of the work, which like is a lot harder and means you're a lot more likely to feel like you're a problem or that you're failing. And so that applies to individual situations, but then also things like online systems that are built in a way that is more stressful for neurodivergent people, because the system labeling them as the problem rather than trying to understand them because they're the minority. But yeah, so this then ties into like a lot of isolation or feeling like excluded, especially like if this is all of your, or not all, but most of your one-on-one interactions, like people can start to internal them as well. Any questions on this? Because the paper is linked at the bottom if you download the slides, but like it's a very simplified version of the concept. Okay. So then what are these different communication styles that neurodivergent people so info dumping, and that kind of goes back to the hyperfocus and then also knowing all of the details. So like if you're taking in everything from the details, you want to share all of them too. And also your focus is much more long-winded than like jumping from thing to thing. So info dumping can be a lot of joy for a lot of different neurodivergent people. There's also a lot, and this can include analogies through personal anecdotes. So a lot of neurodivergent people, they'll hear someone tell one story and they'll respond by telling a story of something that happened in their lives. And that's because in their brain, that's how they're connecting the situations. And it might not be clear at first why they're doing that. It might take a couple questions depending on the person. But that is just the way that they process things showing up in communication. There's also being very direct or literal, which is the one that people know the most. And that can show up in a couple different ways. So that can show up in being very just concise, or just being very blunt about things, trying to be efficient in communication. And also being very literal with jokes. You also get the opposite extreme of people being very sarcastic to the point you can't tell when they're being sarcastic or not. So a world of extremes in general. There's also needing a lot of words to communicate things, which kind of ties in with info dumping, but is a bit different. So like you'll get a lot of emails from neurodivergent people that are like 5 pages long, or they started 5 pages long and then they needed to edit it down. And that goes back to like the bottom-up processing. You're trying to get in all the details. And it can be hard to figure out which ones don't need to be included. It takes more work to tell that. There's also preferring writing or some other form of communication to speaking. A lot of neurodivergent people, especially when talking about things that are more intense, might prefer writing. And that kind of goes with the interoception issues. So like, if I'm talking to you and I have an intense emotion, it might be harder for me to process that emotion. So it might be easier for me to do it when I'm alone, writing it down, and I can just focus on that sensory input. and that can vary from person to person as well and situation to situation. Then there's also using scripts or quotes or repeated phrases, and that's just kind of with social rules in general, or just like if you've had a lot of interactions where you felt like the problem, a script might feel like the safe way to get through it. And then there's also the option of being entirely non-speaking or being able to speak but having trouble with words. And for those people, communications. So that can be visual boards like this person has in the picture, which will just be boards with like different icons they can point at to try to communicate things. Some people prefer ASL. That will also vary greatly. Or you've got the Stephen King, Stephen Hawking typing things out and then the computer reading it out, kind of new. There's now text-to-speech apps you can get on your phone to do that too, if that's something people have trouble with. And some people might be that way all the time. Some people might prefer that mainly when they get overwhelmed and like they lose access to speech sometimes. So it can vary. Any questions on these? Okay. So just takeaways. Sensory processing differences can lead to different behaviors. Can lead to different behaviors that help people regulate different sensory processing can also lead to different experiences with emotions and emotional regulation. Neurodivergent people can have trouble with executive functioning, and then also there different communication experiences that lead to negative interactions with other people. Any questions on this or anything else we've done in the presentation so far?
Just a comment.
Yep.
Personal anecdote.
Okay, yeah.
Which is on the personal anecdote point that you made, which is this idea of showing empathy through shared experience and how that goes against neurotypical cultural norm and in fact can be experienced by neurotypical culture as like on the extreme end kind of that you're not
You're making this about you now.
and it's entirely kind of the opposite from the from the person kind of sharing the anecdote. It's actually kind of a way to express kind of an extreme relation to what the person was kind of explaining, right? And how that can feel so difficult to navigate in I guess mixed neurotype circles.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, to pick up on that, I very often run, especially running into the stereotype. I was undiagnosed autistic at the time, but very stereotypes are lacking in empathy. It's a way of dehumanizing us, when in fact it's just the opposite. A lot of neurodivergent people feel an overabundance of it and need more time to process it. The stereotype comes from, oh, you can't instantly pick up people's emotions, can't instantly pick up their biological character, therefore you must not feel anything, which is nonsense. And I think it goes very much into the double empathy problem. An increased burden is put on neurodivergent people to show what society considers the normal baseline of emotion. But also to account for that, to work overtime, to overclock, thinking about, okay, how is this other person going to respond to this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Masking is written in the next section. But on the empathy point, yeah, autistic people, at least, they tend more towards cognitive empathy or processing empathy in the brain versus affective empathy, which is what non-autistic people tend more towards, which is what you said exactly, not being needing to think about empathy a lot versus immediately in the moment and picking it up based off of the other person's affect. Which is just a lot more work for the brain in general, and that actually gets back to social interactions also. Autistic people, at least, they process it in a different part of the brain, And so like they are literally more work for them, which is why a lot of autistic people might prefer one-on-one interactions to like a group setting, because it is quite literally less work for their brain. All social aspects aside. Yeah, any other questions, comments?
Something that I just kind of keep thinking about is the example in pop culture that we've had over the last decade, although they never used the word autistic, is from The Big Bang Theory.
Yep.
Sheldon Cooper, and he's kind of our poster child
Yes.
of a neurodivergent person, and some of the things that you're saying, some of those kind of stereotypical sorts. Just thinking about him and how he, everybody thought, well, he doesn't have empathy. There's so many things, and so I'm just kind of wondering, like, was that whole phenomenon, is that a good thing that it brought awareness, or was it also, did it
Reinforced a lot.
force some
Yeah.
things? But it just, through this whole thing, I just keep thinking, he's the...
Yeah, that is actually leads well into our next section, which I guess, do we want to take a break or do we want to go into the next section? Or does anyone have questions on this? Because that leads really well into it, actually.
Let's take a break.
Okay, yep. We'll take a break. We'll take a break, and then we'll pick up on that point. Better. The more I'm using the voice, the more it is.
Yeah, you find your flow eventually.
Yeah, well, it's more just like it's literally the muscles aren't cooperating with me right now,
Okay.
and it's very annoying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's strange.
No, I think it's just, I haven't talked this long while at this stage of transition. Yeah. Also, like there was definitely a shift in like where my voice is transitioning this week, which might also be part of the.
Yeah, probably put a strain on it.
Yep.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Yeah. No.
That's good. So.
That's the only way to do it. It's just like, is it me or does it sound at some point cry? Because that's where.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. But the drinking water does seem to help that part, right?
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Good.
You drink water and it goes back down.
Yeah. how we all feeling? Okay. So, now we're just going to talk, kind of going back to like the different stereotypes. So like mainstream understanding of neurodivergence, what neurodivergence looks like can be very limited. There's a lot of stereotypes, and they're mostly informed by middle and upper class white male presentations of neurodivergence. What it was originally studied in, that's what all the tests are developed around, et cetera. So, you know, you've got your Sheldon Cooper's, the autistic savant, who's probably an expert in math or STEM and very bad socially. The probably male ADHDer who just can't sit still and is very disruptive, and always running around, very high energy. Non-speaking neurodivergent people with very highly visible support needs, who you'll see in like Autism Speaks ads to try and like just make it seem like a very bad illness when it's just a different way of being. People who just bluntly say rude things without consideration of anyone else's feelings, and use autism as a pass to do it. And then people who have public outbursts or meltdowns. And like, there are people like that who exist. They're not everyone who is neurodivergent, and definitely not a full or human representation of it. Like some presentations that get overlooked a lot are like people who run a fan page, but or do something else that's like very intensive. Like Hannah Gadsby is autistic. They're a comedian, and they do these great sets where they do a lot of writing, but they struggle to fill out paperwork, or struggle to get bills out because they don't have the money, but just because it's an executive functioning task. People who need to doodle to pay attention in class. Hyperverbal neurodivergent people who burn out compensating just due to lack of support. The extrovert who is super energized by spaces focused on their interests, but drained by superficial interactions. A lot of neurodivergent traits makes it sound like everyone's an introvert. There are sensory-seeking people in particular who are very extroverted. People who are highly empathetic or sensitive to others' emotions in a way that can feel overwhelming and that can be hard to express. And then also people who can function normally in public, but then collapse and struggle with her in private. And those often get overlooked because we're looking at they're more internal, and they can look closer to the social norms, and also they're the ways that a lot of more marginalized people with other marginalized identities can present being neurodivergent versus white middle class males. Cis males. And this brings us to neurodivergent masking. So the reason a lot of people go into these more internalized presentations, some of it can be just preference and how people do it, but a lot of it is also masking. So with the double empathy problem, you have all these interactions, like the way you socialize is the problem. So what do? You try to hide your neurodivergent traits in order to better fit in with the world. And to be clear, everyone masks to one degree or another. I kind of like to think of this as like a spectrum of neuroperformativity, kind of in the same way gender is a performance, where like people are pressured to meet this ideal of gender presentations that no one will ever hit, and that might be easier to reach for some people, but incredibly painful and unaffirming for others. Same with neurotypicality. Like there's this ideal of neurotypicality everyone's pressured to meet. Everyone will have to mask to meet that sometimes, but it will be easier for people who are more neurotypical, and more draining for people who are more neurodivergent. So with masking, it's done in a couple ways. So compensation, so that's just developing strategies to make up for things that you struggle with. And that can be something like setting yourself reminders to make phone calls, or getting people with you, or just sitting down and forcing yourself to do something at the last minute because that's the only way you can get yourself to start. There's also scripting and mimicry. So there's a lot of neurodivergent people who will talk about learning to have a conversation by watching TV shows, or watching figuring that out. They might not fully understand why people do that, but they will do it anyway. So like asking, how are you, etc. And then the big one for neurodivergent people in particular is sensory suppression. So that's suppressing stim. So instead of finding an alternative that's quiet, or doing stimming at all, themselves not to. Dealing with distress, suppressing your distress about overwhelming sensory stimuli. So, so being in a loud environment and just forcing yourself to sit there rather than putting in earplugs or asking to go someplace to go quiet, dealing with the stress of that later, and also seeking sensory stimuli that and suppressing the need to seek sensory stimuli. So like that for a lot of people, if they need certain stimuli like stimming or music to be able to focus, they'll try to force themselves to do it, even though that's not how their brains work, and that's really draining for them. I'm gonna do water real quick. Any questions on this? This does bear a lot with like code switching, or like it's analogous to things like passing in other groups. Like most marginalized groups have an equivalent of this. This is just the one that's used for neurodivergence. There are some additional notes, like everyone of every neurotype does it. And for neurodivergent people, not everyone can do it. For the people who can, it can get a certain amount of social and or emotional, you can get a job, you're not getting harassed in public, you can have at least social interactions regularly, even if like you're not being your full authentic self in them, so they feel a little superficial. But it's usually at the expense of their well-being in the long term. Neurodivergent burnout is a big thing up in the neurodivergent community, and that's when people do this so much that they become too exhausted to do that or to do other basic functions that they were able to do before, just because they've been doing it for so long. And that's why it is important for neurodivergent people to have places where they feel included and accepted, even when expressing their neurodivergent traits. For some neurodivergent, especially those who are late identified and who learned to mask when they were little kids and haven't been able to do it, that can take a lot of time. Like they need to learn how to unmask or to let themselves be authentic. But having those spaces is vital to prevent things like burnout or other chronic health issues. At the same time, unmasking isn't an option all the time for all people. We'll have a bit on neurodivergent people who are also BIPOC. Like that's a safety concern a lot of the time, and even for people in general, like the unemployment rate for autistic people in particular is it's like 35%. And so like masking can be a vital part of just being able to keep a job and pay rent. So full unmasking isn't always an option, but you also need places to unmask, which can be a difficult thing for people to balance. Any questions, comments? Okay. So then we have people who are neurodivergent and otherwise marginalized, who are usually more pressured to mask. They're also usually, because they are masking it all the time, they're under-identified. So, and then a couple other, and they're also usually under-identified as kids. There's a couple of stigma and bias. So neurodivergent traits being labeled as quirks or nerdiness or laziness, character flaws, criminal behavior, etc., instead of being directed to testing. Oh, that's just something you should deal with. There's also testing biases, the upper middle, which is where you get like the focus on, there's one test where they literally ask you 3 times if you like numbers, not anything else, even though like neurodivergent people can have special interests in things that aren't math. There's also just differences in the presentation, because the traits and also like socialization can lead to different special interests, so a lot more neurodivergent people who were assigned female at birth can have special interests in things like boy bands or romance novels or fan fiction, which don't get clocked as neurodivergence because oh, those are normal things for a girl to be interested in, even if like they're doing it with more intensity than a neurotypical person would. Yep.
Bring home the point around gender stereotypes and that learning toys when a young girl or AFAB individual were to do that, it's kind of socially celebrated as learning to like clean up and perform girl roles or woman roles, right? And goes kind of unnoticed or under the radar, or with teenagers you know, like lining up in care stuff, like on there, or straightening out their room, really kind of a celebrated thing when, you know, the equivalent in an AMAB individual would be kind of a gateway to testing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I was really into lining up things to decorate the windows for Halloween, and it was fine because I was raised as I was seen as a girl, whereas in a boy that would be seen differently. There's also a lot of language barriers and cultural barriers that can lead to diagnoses. And like this is not just a problem like here where it's primarily English-speaking country people that also speak other languages, but also like this prevents access internationally from people who live in non-English speaking countries. A lot of the time the information on neurodivergence is decades behind where it is in English speaking countries, and that is a huge access barrier. And there's also cultural differences. So like if we go back to the neurodiversity forms of neurodivergence that are pathologized, or even what is a normal brain is socially constructed. What that is varies from culture to culture. So like some people who are seen as neurodivergent in our culture wouldn't be seen as neurodivergent in others. There's also just, there's not awareness of neurodivergence. So people are still labeled as lazy or like just off or weird, etc. So like it will vary a lot from place to place. Do you have a comment or?
It should still. No, it's okay. I don't know. I was going to say all of this is very relatable. I was diagnosed very late, only because I actively sought it myself, and it was actually after I came out of non-binary. None of it was just how I was growing up. It was just there's things. It was reflected on the other things. I was conditioned to think it was everything else was just wrong.
Yep. Yeah, that is an all too common story, and especially if you have other marginalized identities or just presented in a slightly different way. I will also say there are a lot of people even with like low support, it get missed a lot of the time. Particularly if you have like the gifted and neurodivergent child, and you'll be seen as either neurodivergent or you're gifted, and the neurodivergence gets overlooked. And it's just that you have a lot of potential, but you can't seem to act on it. So yeah, there's a lot of things that prevent people from being identified neurodivergent. So now we're just going to go into like different, very common other forms of marginalization that show up and the difficulties that they face. So neurodivergent women often face, or people who are raised as women as well, have a lot of pressure to mask. And safer in some ways, but can also prevent them from forming genuine connections with other people, and also keep them from being able to identify their own emotions and needs. They're also more likely to get overlooked because like a lot of neurodivergent women, like the manic pixie dream girl in hindsight is like just a neurodivergent identified in a way. So it will be labeled as quirkiness or laziness, or just being a nerd, or personal failings as well. But with the not having genuine connections or being in touch with their emotional needs, they're more vulnerable to violence and traumatic experiences because they're getting less genuine support, and also they're less likely to notice when they feel there's a red flag. And they also face a lot of co-occurring mental health challenges and also chronic health challenges because minority stress is fun. And then within neurodivergent spaces, neurodivergent women can often be a minority, which means there's things like sexism or sexual harassment, just because they're used to it being an all cis male space, and they're not used to having to deal with women as people. Any questions, comments on this? I know like this can be a big topic area for people. Oh, okay. Yep.
In case anybody else did, because I've
yes.
Just one of my stims was playing with my hair and how that can be interpreted as flirtatious in neurotypical situations, right?
Yes, that would.
And that leaves you extremely vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
I'm not being unable to sort of understand that that's what that is either.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, incredibly potential problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so then another form of being neurodivergent and otherwise marginalized is being BIPOC, which BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. BIPOC neurodivergent individuals can often feel alienated within their communities of origin because they have an empathy problem as well. But this will also vary from culture to culture. I've met a couple Indigenous people where, like, in talking to them, it was just like, have you ever thought that you might be neurodivergent? And they're like, by Western standards, it might be, but within my culture, this is just a generally accepted thing. And it's like, okay, great. Good for you. So, like, that is a big difference that can show up. However, within, like, our Western society, they are at higher risk of facing violence or incarceration for displaying neurodivergent traits. Just last year, there was a Black teenager, autistic teenager, who had a meltdown and got big within neurodivergent circles. So, like, this is a big thing, and the school to prison pipeline is really big for neurodivergent people as well. So instead of getting diagnosed, they'll get sent to prison, they'll get suspended a lot, they'll get punished rather than get supported. Or even just sent to get an evaluation. Counter racism within neurodivergent spaces or when seeking services. This will vary from location to location. So, like, I've worked at an agency in New York, and, like, most of the neurodivergent people were people of color, but that's not the same place everywhere else. And particularly, like, the movement spaces are overwhelmingly white. And so you get a lot of neurodivergent people reporting racism or just their perspectives getting overlooked as a result. And then there are also just, like, cultural differences within these spaces that can also make it alienating. And there are more BIPOC specific spaces that are popping up for BIPOC people to connect with each other and share their own experiences. But, like, it can just lead to a lot of difficulties or a lot of challenges just socially. And it's still developing. Now, another very common form of being otherwise marginalized and neurodivergent is being LGBTQ. There is a huge overlap with these. If you are neurodivergent, you are significantly more likely to identify as LGBTQ, and that's for a lot of reasons. Some of it is just the way the cognitive processing happens, and with all the other social differences, you're more likely to be LGBTQ is a big theory. And then also, that's really the main ones. But people who are LGBTQ and neurodivergent, they're more likely to realize it, they're more likely to be out, and they're also more likely to have experienced trauma that made them neurodivergent. So if we think about innate versus, most LGBTQ people have experienced some form of trauma. And so, like, if we're counting PTSD as a form of neurodivergence, most LGBTQ people are neurodivergent. So in many cases, being innately neurodivergent has been used as a reason to deny individual LGBTQ people. This has actually been, people have attempted to do this in laws recently where, I forget which state, but one state tried to pass a law, or I hope, as I know it, it's only one state, it's likely more knowing how the way the world's going, but they tried to pass a law where if you haven't had an autism diagnosis, you couldn't get access gender affirming care, which is, it's not great. And then also historically, many services for neurodivergent people have not been LGBTQ affirming, just because they were like, we're focused on supporting you with this thing. We don't need to think about your gender or your sexuality because you don't have one. And then a lot of things that are more visible tend to not be neurodivergent friendly. So, like, the things that you see on TV a lot of the time or that you hear about the most are things like clubs or bars or just places that are very loud. And even like pride parades, like the main one in New York, like, they're not neurodivergent friendly at all. They're very loud, they're very crowded. Not any quiet spaces to go and calm down. And so, like, that can lead to feelings of exclusion, though the internet has kind of leveled the playing field there and enabled people to find the queer knitting groups and reading groups that are much more to their taste. And so this isolates neurodivergent and LGBTQ individuals and does lead them more vulnerable to violence and other forms as well. Which brings us to the last one. So with all of this minority stress on top of the layered on top of each other, neurodivergent people are more likely to have other mental health issues, chronic illnesses, or physical disabilities. A lot of that minority stress showing up in different ways. It can be more difficult for them to get diagnoses and treatment due to communication differences with doctors. Doctors going like, oh, that's just your autism, or oh, that's just your ADHD, or oh, you're making a big deal out of nothing, and other forms of bias. And then also a lot of tropes for neurotypical people, and may not work as well for neurodivergent people for various reasons. Additionally, some forms of neurodivergence can get misdiagnosed as other mental health issues. For example, for a lot of people who were assigned female at birth and are autistic, they get diagnosed with BP, both forms of BPD, or both things that can stand for, just because the emotional intensity they experience will get mistaken for mood swings or different forms of attachment trauma, when it's more their autism showing up in different ways with trauma layered on top of it. And additional challenges, especially physical ones, can significantly affect the ability to access physical spaces or communities at all, be they neurodivergent spaces or spaces for your other marginalized groups, just because like a lot of spaces aren't physically accessible, or people will have less access to transportation to get there, et cetera. Any thoughts or questions on any of these? Because I just kind of ran through a lot of groups. Yes. Let's get the mic.
Thank you for all of this. I'm also thinking about people in substance recovery groups, a time in substance recovery groups.
Yes.
And number one, I don't see a lot of tolerance or acceptance of BIPOC folks. And thankfully, there are more, since the pandemic, there are more BIPOC support groups. Because the internet has brought people together. And I'm thinking about someone who's masking, getting along in society, and substances help,
Yes.
tolerate life, and then a decision is made and for whatever reason to take away, and I don't know, what's left are recovery support groups, and I don't see that really being very helpful in a lot of cases. So it's just another area we need more and compassion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. To clarify, are you when you say like people using a substance to get by, are you referring to self-medicating, or like people getting diagnosed like stimulants and not being
More self-medication.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Self-medication is huge, especially for late identified neurodivergent adults, especially like just as a sensory regulation thing, it can be huge. And also for social situations, a lot of neurodivergent people will turn to things like alcohol or weed to help them relax enough to be able to deal with the pressures of like neurotypical society. There's also a lot of people with undiagnosed or just untreated ADHD that will use weed to help manage it, which both sucks in terms of substance use recovery, because like they're literally using it to get by, but also when they try to get treatment, they'll be told like, oh, you need to stop using this thing that you in order for us to prescribe you the thing that isn't weed. So it's kind of
total abstinence then. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but this idea of the model of total abstinence, right, being very, very neurotypical model.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so rigid. I mean, for some neurotypical people too, and so many of the recovery groups are based on the foundation of total abstinence, or
At all times.
you can't really participate. Yeah.
Yeah, which is really hard because you go from even if that is a goal, like you go from using it to cope to having to deal with all of these things you were avoiding all at once. Yeah. Any other thoughts? So if there aren't any other thoughts, just broad takeaways from this section, like our conceptions of neurodivergent, what neurodivergence looks like, are generally the ones that are more just visible and disruptive to other people, like the Sheldon Coopers. of the world, and they look over the internal presentations that may cause difficulties to the individual, but not the people around them. A lot of neurodivergent people hide or mask their neurodivergent traits, which can cause a lot of burnout, even if it is keeping them safe in the short term. And people with other marginalized identities, like being woman, BIPOC, and or LGBTQ are more likely to mask. People with other marginalized experiences are more likely to have their neurodivergence overlooked and to face additional challenges because intersectionality is fun sometimes. So, any last check-in for questions on this section? You can also ask more if you think of them. Yes, yes. It's for the recording.
People won't know what.
I guess something to add to that. The first diagnosis I received as an adolescent was depression, and that kind of dominated everything else. I was told that the chronic migraines I have, treat the depression first and that'll go away.
Yep.
Later on, I had a former therapist tell me, no, I don't think you have gender dysphoria. I think that's just depression. I would also have another different therapist, tell me later, I don't think you're autistic. I think you're autistic. It's and I think that directly relates to what you were talking about. That having one label put on you can make it harder to figure out what else is going on, because that tends to override everything else, and it gets overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I actually was doing an intake for a client this week where they, the main thing they were talking about was their depression of having trouble starting things. And after talking with them, it's like, okay, are you having trouble starting things because like you're thinking like, oh, I'm a terrible person? They're just like, no, I think I want to do this. And then I get into the spiral, which is like, do you think you have ADHD? And they're like, yes, but I brought it up with 3 therapists, and they just tell me it's the depression. It's like, okay, has that worked? And it's like, nope. Okay, let's try treating it like ADHD. It's just like, people focus on the external behavior without checking in about what's going on in the brain, and like, that leads to a lot of that getting overlooked, because we only understand the understanding of neurodivergence has primarily focused on that external behavior and that external experience historically. Does anyone else have anything? Yeah.
I don't know if you're planning to do this later, but could you just briefly speak about how diagnosis or assessment occurs? I mean, is it all? Yeah, just a little bit about.
I wasn't planning on explaining that. I guess like that would be, so like neurodivergence is broad, vary based off of like what form of neurodivergence you're getting a diagnosis for. Like generally, like for kids, like it usually happens through a school. So like a teacher will point something out, or a parent will notice something, and they'll get referred to a psychologist with a school or like someone out of there. For adults, the process is a lot harder, and this is kind of where a lot of the self-valid culture also gets reinforced, where it's just like you need to find someone who is a psychologist or a psychiatrist who diagnoses these things and is also familiar with how it presents in adults, because giving an adult a diagnostic test you would give to a kid is not always accurate, because usually being an adult with diagnosis, you found some kind of coping mechanism to get by. So it's a lot harder. I guess, like, what are you asking about specific tests, or what happens during
I
these?
guess it was more about, is it, when you're using the word tests, so they're like psychological tests, they're not brain scans.
No.
It's more of a psychological.
Well, for the forms of neurodivergence, they're like autism and such. Like for things like epilepsy, because epilepsy is also a form of neurodivergence. This is where it's like, it depends what form of neurodivergence are you asking about. PTSD is also a form of neurodivergence, and so like it will vary, but most of the time it's if someone knows diagnosis, it will be a psychiatric test unless it is something more physical. Yep. Any other questions? Okay. Do we want to take a quick break? How are you feeling? Good. Good. We want to keep going? Okay. Okay, So this is just strategies for including neurodivergent people, and this is very broad. Like, you could spend a lot of time going into this, and we will do that in future workshops. So a big one is just like having information on accessibility available in advance. So like if you have flyers or we'll call in, like tell them things like, oh, we have a ramp, or oh, we have a quiet space where you can calm down, etc. Because that decreases the anxiety about planning if people know their needs will be met. And it decreases like the number of hoops they have to jump through if they don't have to communicate with you in advance. Or they don't do themselves out by going, oh, the needs won't be met at this thing, so I'm not going. Additionally, have multiple ways that people can access events. So like a lot of neurodivergent people can have trouble getting to physical spaces, either because of physical accessibility needs or just because the world is so exhausting that they would prefer to do it at home. So doing things both in person and online can be very helpful when it is possible. Of course, like you can't do that for every group. And then also having multiple forms of communication. So having things written out and then also presented verbally, maybe having an easy read version of something, which is just a more lay person who's out. Having quiet space available where people can go if needed, and also make it known that those are available in advance, because it's a planning thing. A lot of neurodivergent people I know, they're comforted when they know that there's a quiet place that they can go, even if they don't use it, just because they know, like, okay, if I start to get overwhelmed, I can go there, rather than having to figure out how to be overwhelmed by myself. And then normalizing stimming and other forms of sensory regulation. So have stim toys there. Say it's okay for people to stim. Like, don't judge people for doing it. If it's not disruptive, and if it is disruptive, try to find alternatives or just in place that they can do it that isn't as disruptive, so that people can regulate. And then also other forms of sensory regulation, like wearing earplugs or using ear defenders, wearing tinted glasses, and not treating that as weird, because people regulate their needs in different ways. Be flexible and open to different forms of communication in both one-on-one and group settings. Try to assume good intentions and figure out and focus on like what's going on internally with the person and why they're doing something, rather than labeling the external behavior immediately. Also, a big one is just recognizing accessibility as a journey and not the destination. Steps you take to make one event accessible may not work for another event, and also, like, depending on the community needs, what makes it more accessible, it will be different. So like if you're in a community with a lot of deaf and hard of hearing people, it's a big priority to have someone who can do ASL there or have closed captioning. Whereas if you're in an environment where there's more neurodivergent people, but not or more Spanish-speaking people, it might be good to have that kind of translator, and to make it known that you have that. But it will vary from event to event. If you have a rock climbing event, the accessibility needs will be different if you're running a book club than if you're running a workshop. And those, additionally, be flexible when people have conflicting accessibility needs. The most common one of this version of this you'll see in neurodivergent spaces is someone having a verbal stim, so like going repeatedly, and having a lot of people with like sensory sensitivities, auditory sensitivities. Like those aren't really compatible, so being flexible with that. I've been at events where like they'll have a room where like the person with the verbal stims can watch in a separate place. There are places where they'll give the people with auditory sensitivities like ear defenders, but it will vary a lot based off of like resources the organization has and what is available in general. So be flexible with that, because that does come up. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for that. And then also just in general, don't forget other forms of inclusion. Like we went over, like people with other forms of marginalization often feel excluded in divergent places, so and other places as well. So making a point to be inclusive to them is just as important for accessibility as everything else. Yeah, so takeaways, we went over the difference between neurodiversity and neurodivergent, neurodivergent relationship between difference and disability. We went over the origins and goals of the neurodiversity movement. We went over general cognitive, sensory, executive functioning and social differences that neurodivergent people may experience, how neurodivergence can manifest and be experienced in diverse ways, and general strategies to make spaces accessible for all neurotypes. Now just, again, any questions, comments? I know we kind of covered a lot here. I can also go back to any slides if people want to view those. Yep.
On a very quick note, and some of you may know this already, the Rockettes this past year engaged neurodiverse consultants, and they offered several shows modified, taking out the loud noises and bangs and the 3D flashing lights, and they offered ear covers and so forth, and they weren't sure how well it was going to be received. It was massively popular, so they're going to continue that.
That's awesome. Yeah. I know, I didn't know about that, but I know that Broadway in general has been making a lot of efforts on that front. Like they have a lot of like days where you can get tickets to see like a neurodiversity friendly show. So yeah, that's great to hear. That's cool. Yep.
No, I would just like to make one comment. I mean, I'm a teacher, and like one thing I've found is that teachers are not really educated in this, and we a lot of times last year had to go out of my own way to figure out how to handle or to work with these children. And what I found worked a lot, which was really good, was what worked for me. I really had to communicate to the parents and then tell the parents, because the hard part for the kids is that good year with next year they go to a new teacher and they start all over again.
Yeah.
And that's really what I find a real challenge for the students. So I try to really, with some of the children, meet with the parents at the end of the year and really tell the parents you have to advocate for your child and really let the teacher know what worked. And because it's just really tough for these kids. Like they just every year start over. And I found that at least some strategies are in place, and if they can give that to the teacher, then they have a starting point. And then, like you said, every child's different, so it is challenging, but that sometimes does work.
Yeah, no, we did that, and you're absolutely right with like starting with a new teacher every year is very neurotypical kind of like construct, because it makes it really hard on the students to have to start over. They have their hand raised over there if we want to pass the mic.
I worked in special education for years, and something I implemented was called a transitional meeting, whereby in June or early September, I sat down with the receiving teacher and the teacher who had the child for 9 months, and we discussed the do's and the don'ts. It made a world of difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, your pen is amazing. It's sparkly. Your pen is your pen looks nice. It's
She likes your pen.
Oh, you like my pen?
yes, it's sparkly.
Okay, dollar store.
Anyone else?
Just a comment piggybacking off. They just left. What to do and how to cope with work and making sure we're being neurodiversity affirming when we're working within systems that perpetuate like all of the above. So top down kind of, I guess, neurotypical systems that are some authority to access, and we're kind of like working within them. And the medical model within mental health setting is one, and then schools and kind of teaching is another example of that. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts, because I just find it, I sit with a kind of ick, right, working in mental, having to access things like insurance and access things like assessment through neuropsych providers, just sort of navigating those communications in a very kind of neurodivergent, and I think the same is probably true for kind of teaching. And I just any words of wisdom from anybody?
Yeah, that's a hard one to have words of wisdom for. We definitely seem to be in a transitional period with that, where it's like the systems have been working like that for years, but hopefully with more adverse visibility, like it will start to shift. But yeah, it's definitely like it's shifting, but it's shifting slowly. And
I feel like
yeah.
COVID shifted a lot, actually.
Oh yeah, it did.
Yeah, in that respect, in terms of accessibility, just for one example.
Oh yeah, telehealth is great. Yeah, does anyone else have any other questions or comments? Okay, I will also say in terms of like, in particularly with like resources in terms of having to teach yourself as a teacher, which like that is a problem. I do have so first we have a couple other workshops coming up. The next one is specifically for helping professionals and families, and that does include teachers. Then we're going to, we're going to have one on building neuro-inclusive communities and organizations on April 5th. And then one on navigating identity and adulthood for neuroqueer people on May 3rd. All of them will be here at River Edge Public Library and also streamed on YouTube, and they will be free as well. And you could RS by contacting Craig. And then I also just have a bunch of resources here. I could go back to get the QR code if anyone didn't get the slides on their phone at the beginning, but there's a lot of different resources for all kinds of neurodivergence at the end of the slides as well, that people can go through.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. We so appreciate your support. The questions that were posed were excellent. We appreciate all your feedback. Our next program is on February 15th, and that is specifically for people in the...
You mean March 1st? Today's February 15th.
Sorry. Wishful thinking. Our next program will be on Saturday, March 1st, and that will be Neuroaffirming Approaches for Helping Professionals and Families, and that will be for people who are teachers, people in mental health care, people in advocacy roles, anyone in social services, business environments. So we encourage everyone to come. And if you know of someone in your life, whether personal or professional, who you think might benefit, please tell them about these workshops. We're really glad to have everyone. Further ado, we will wish everyone a wonderful day. Thank you again to Kate Peterman for providing such a comprehensive and thorough overview of neurodiversity and neuroinclusion, and we look forward to hearing more from you.
Yep, excited to see all.
Thank you, Kay. A job exceptionally well done.
Just because you're in the back.